leaving Gaza. Have any more been able to leave today? I know 40 were on the list.
We're expecting people to be leaving today. Every day there are more and more Canadians are getting out of Gaza. It's a very slow process. It's a complicated process, but my shout out is to the embassy staff in Ramallah, the mission in Ramallah and Cairo. They're working hard to get them out.
There were 80 on the list yesterday, 40 on the list today. There are hundreds in Gaza, many getting frustrated saying, why can't we get out? How do you explain the slow process that you mentioned there?
It's a complicated process. We're working with Qatar, who is an intermediary, with Egypt, with Israel. It is very difficult to communicate. We have internet that's on and off, and we have a dangerous situation. You can't bring people out in the middle of a war, so we're also calling for humanitarian pauses at the same time so we can get more people out. It's very dangerous.
There's also now an added problem in that the North and the South are completely cut off from one another. What are we doing to try and help or reach Canadians that are in the north part that is cut off and can't reach Rafah?
It's again through our Ottawa Emergency Watch Response Center as well as our mission in Ramallah. We're in contact with them pretty consistently, but sometimes we only have 5% internet coverage. So we're able to, but we're contacting them, and we're still hopeful that we will get a steady increase of Canadians and permanent residents out of the area.
I realize that adapt getting people prepared to come to Canada.
All I know is that consular staff are working with them, providing them with food, shelter, medical assistance if they need it, and supporting them once they get. They're waiting for them at the border and then supporting them.
Any update on any further Canadians getting out today?
Of course, it is up to union members themselves to make decisions about their leadership. But, of course, anti-Semitic comments are unacceptable.
Est-ce que votre ministère a interpellé Cape pour savoir qu'est-ce qui s'est passé et est-ce que vous allez lancer une enquête dans cette situation-là?
Je dois continuer de suivre qu'est-ce qu'il a dit. Je n'ai pas à ce moment les mots exacts, mais je vais les chercher et je vais décider qu'est-ce qu'on doit faire dans ces circonstances. Mais je voudrais dire que c'est les membres du syndicat qui décident qu'est-ce qui va passer avec leur leadership.
Est-ce que vous pourriez lancer une enquête dans cette affaire-là de votre côté?
C'est pas dans mon domaine de choisir, de décider qu'est-ce qui va passer avec le leadership du syndicat. Mais en général, c'est pas acceptable d'avoir ces commentaires antisémitiques sur n'importe quoi plateforme. Merci.
Réaction au propos d'Adil Charkaoui. Vous avez certainement pris connaissance lors d'un discours à Montréal. Réaction.
Mais comme j'ai dit à la presse, je crois que, quant à moi, ça dépasse la ligne criminelle et j'espère bien que les policiers vont agir.
Allez-vous porter plainte vous-même dans un cas comme celui-là? Ou...
Je ne crois pas que c'est moi. C'est pas aux politiciens de dire aux policiers comment d'agir.
Mais vous portez plainte comme citoyen?
Mais les policiers peuvent agir même si les citoyens ne portent pas de plainte. Je crois que tout le monde l'a vu. Et j'espère que dans tout le pays, les policiers vont faire attention que c'est très important d'avoir la liberté d'expression, mais quand vous dépassez la liberté d'expression et vous tombez dans la haine, dans le code criminel, il devrait agir.
In English, sir?
Sure. What was asked was about the comments of Mr. Charkaoui, and as I stated, from my perspective, they seem to have crossed the line and gone into criminal speech, hate speech. So I do hope the police look at it very carefully, and if they find that they will act. I think that it's really important to protect freedom of speech in the country, but when you call upon people to murder Zionists, you're crossing a very, very thin line, and it's not a good thing in our country where people are calling upon other people to harm identifiable groups. It's very scary.
Mr. Housefather, what do you think of comments a few days ago? The head of the third largest public sector union resigned after messages that he posted on Facebook reportedly started going around, where namely he called Israel the root of all evil and posts like that. What does that make you say about unions and federal public service?
Well, I don't think it speaks to unions. It speaks to him and his character. I would never attribute somebody somebody's comments to their entire membership. But what I would say right now is I've never seen a time when Jewish Canadians have felt as scared, as angry, as frustrated in a country that we've been part of since before Confederation existed. And I think that there needs to be very specific action taken. Condemnatory words are one thing, but it's very important for police across this country to watch when demonstrators cross a line and speak hate speech and call for genocide against people and call for killing of people or harming of people. We just had a firebombing at the Bat Tikva synagogue where I grew up in Dollard des Ormeaux, and it is not something that we could take lightly. It is really important that police need to crack down now. Mais c'est sûr que ça me touche personnellement. Je connais ben de monde dans la communauté juive. Je suis de la communauté juive. J'en ai un comté où un tiers de la population est de la communauté juive. Et j'entends la peur, l'angoisse, la frustration, le rage tous les jours. Et c'est quelque chose qui est inacceptable au Canada, dans une société comme la nôtre. J'ai eu un ancien combattant qui m'a dit, il a vécu à Montréal toute sa vie, il a 97-98 ans, il était un soldat canadien dans la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, il a dit qu'il n'a jamais vu l'antisémitisme comme ça à Montréal depuis les 1930. Et ça, c'est inacceptable.
Have you felt unsafe yourself in recent days?
Look, I don't think I've had my own incidents, but I don't think I'm the person that's important. I've heard from students across the country that feel that they can't walk across campus wearing a Star of David, that feel that they're being assaulted by fellow students. They're being lectured by teachers who are telling them that Israel is a criminal state in classes. There is something wrong in this country where a war in the Middle East has spread into Canada and making Jewish Canadians feel this unsafe. And it's not an uncommon feeling. This is the majority feeling right now. Everyone will tell you that. And the incident in Dollard where the synagogue was firebombed is something that just shows how these insightful words can lead to real street violence, and we can't allow that.
Dans le caucus avec la lettre qui a été écrite il y a quelques semaines, quelle est l'ambiance dans le caucus? Parce que le caucus est aussi déchiré sur cette question-là.
Mais nous avons un caucus qui représente toute la population de la pays. Et le caucus libéral, ça c'est une grande force dans le parti libéral que représentons tout le monde. Et il y a des discussions qui sont des fois difficiles. Tout le monde a le droit de prendre position. Quant à moi, j'étais complètement contre ce qu'ils ont écrit dans la lettre, mais ils ont le droit de le écrire.
Mais les commentaires que vous entendez de la fonction publique, il y a des fonctionnaires qui ont ce genre de discours-là, notamment la situation avec le président de la CEP. Comment vous réagissez à ça et comment le gouvernement, votre gouvernement, devrait réagir à tout ça?
Mais les actions à l'intérieur d'un syndicat sont les actions à l'intérieur d'un syndicat. Il y a des processus dans le syndicat. Je crois qu'il y a des groupes qui ont maintenant commencé une poursuite en Ontario contre le syndicat. Et je vais dire, qu'est-ce que moi je peux dire? Je condamne tout le monde qui utilise leur position dans un syndicat pour promulguer l'antisémitisme ou promulguer la haine.
Mais par rapport on the hate crime laws, people on the Islamophobia side are also saying they don't feel like these laws are strong enough, that they should be beefed up to try and deal with a lot of the hate we've been seeing in recent weeks. What's your thought on this, given the rise in antisemitism and issues?
I think we have strong hate crime laws and the police should enforce them. Thank you.
Talking to a lot of people who are just extremely afraid and haven't been this afraid in years, if ever.
So we've definitely seen a rise of incidences amongst communities, particularly the Jewish community, where it comes to anti-Semitism. The events in Montreal yesterday were frankly shocking. This is why we put forward on Monday with the announcement $5 million going forward to ensure that we can have enhanced security in places like community centers, synagogues, places where the community gathers and also works. We understand this is a heightened time and we'll do everything we can working with law enforcement and other community partners to make sure communities are safe.
Are you getting a lot of calls from your constituents asking for the government to do more?
I think everyone's concerned right now. Thank you.
What do you make of the protests we see every weekend? Thousands of people taking to the streets. Some are voicing concerns around anti-Semitic comments. There are others say that these are people who are simply advocating for the lives of Palestinians. What do you
I
make
think
of
peaceful protests are important. Peaceful protests. If people want to come outside and do peaceful protest, I think like freedom of speech should be there. and violence should not happen in the protest. So peaceful, and I saw like many people are coming out, and they are saying that they want to see a ceasefire.
What do you make? Do you worry that this free speech might be getting lost in this conflict? Because there are some people saying, you know, these protests are pro-Hamas. They have concerns about some of the statements and chants that are coming from these protests.
That's what I'm saying. The protests should be peaceful. And if people are coming out in support of the loss of the innocent civilians, and as long as they are peaceful, I think people have the right to speak.
Ms. do you feel that people who are speaking out to support Palestinian civilians are being silenced, or like there have been instances where people are
it's concerning to see the rise in the cases of Islamophobia and antisemitism in Canada. This is not a Canada like we want. We want people to come together as one community and live peacefully. Canadians are going to be courageous. They are going to be patient. And I think it's really very important that we come together as one.
Is there anything more you think the federal government can do, or other locals of government can do, to deal with the rise in Islamophobia and reports that I'm sure you're hearing?
I think it's important that we make sure, like, I think just one example of announcing more money for the infrastructure, SIP funding, I think is a good thing to do to make sure that religious organizations can build more security infrastructures within the mosques, within the synagogues, within the churches, because people are really very fearful. So I think it's important that we make sure that, like, there is more presence of the police at these protests so that, like, they remain, like, peaceful.
Do you feel like there should be more mental health supports made available to communities?
Yeah, people are going through a lot. See, like, it's not easy to see the pictures which are coming in, and because of social media, like, everyone has access to it. I'm really concerned because, like, I never saw that at the age of 23, 25, what my sons are seeing. So I have two sons, 23 and 25-year-old, and I am really concerned about their mental health, what they are going through, why they, like, so I think it's really very important that there are more supports for the people.
Okay. I'm wondering if you sort of caught anything the Prime Minister said this morning, calling for humanitarian pauses and the need for a two-state solution. You seem more passionate about it. I'm just curious what you think about that, if that's really the direction that, or if that's even a possible direction to go.
Yeah. Well, I was in caucus when he made those comments, so I'll have to take a moment to listen to them when I get out of here. But humanitarian pauses in a two-state solution. That's what he's been saying for weeks. That's what I've been saying for weeks. That's what the United States has been saying for weeks. Two-state solution, of course, is a belief in public policy solution in the Middle East that has existed for a very long time. But everyone is calling for a pause of some kind. Now, of course, there are differences of opinion in terms of what a ceasefire would look like versus what humanitarian pauses would look like. But yeah, I think that the Prime Minister is reacting, as I am and many others too, which is a very strong need for critical aid to flow into Gaza right now, and for Prime Minister Netanyahu to recognize that there is a necessity at this moment in time for a humanitarian pause that does not detract from Israel's ability and need to deal with the threat that is Hamas, but that responds to the need that is being faced right now by the people of Gaza.
Is it two-state possible to be talked about as long as Hamas is at the table or in existence? Like, can we have that conversation as long as an entity we've decided is or described as a terrorist is part of this?
Yeah, I think a two-state solution with Hamas is not what people are talking about. I think that there is a belief that Hamas does not represent the people of Gaza, and that Hamas, as Israel is trying to do now, should be eradicated from the position of leadership that it currently exercises in Gaza. So I think that there's an important component of this which suggests that a two-state solution is what we all want to achieve knowing that one day Hamas is not going to be those with whom we are seeking a two-state solution.
The Prime Minister was also quite passionate this morning about the rise in hate that we're seeing in Canada, the need for that to end. What do you think needs, like, how do we tamp down this obvious, it's, you and I both know that what people are doing, what people are experiencing. How do we bring that down?
Two things. One, in terms of the real practical ways that we can contribute to safety and security, goes back to the announcement that Minister Leblanc made the other day in regards to an increase in both the amount of money and the flexibility of how that money is used for security infrastructure. We have to restore a sense of safety and security to Canadians in vulnerable communities right now. But the second piece is the way that we conduct ourselves, the way that we convey our messages. I don't know if you happened to catch a piece I wrote the other day for National News Watch, and I'm trying to articulate this. And interestingly enough, what happened right after I had that piece published was 3 examples of either I wasn't condemning this strongly enough, or I wasn't condemning that strongly enough, or I was complicit in this or complicit in that. We have to take, I talked about in that article, this importance of a trauma-informed approach. People are traumatized right now, whether that's by virtue of what has just happened or is happening, or what's happened over the last 100+ years. So what that means is that we have to move from judgment to curiosity, and what that looks like in the form of a question is moving from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. So we have to keep the temperature down, because what happens when the temperature rises is that it fuels this incitement of hate, and that hate is what leads to Molotov cocktails being thrown at synagogues. So we have to be extremely mindful as journalists, as elected officials, and as everyday people in our communities across the country, that the words that we use and the way in which we characterize our viewpoints and the way in which we work with one another through dialogue is incredibly important to bringing down that temperature, which in turn will help us deal with that escalation of hate.
Can I ask you just a quick question? I'm sorry if you already answered it while I was scrumming over there, but can you give us an idea as to what sort of conversations are going on in the caucus right now? You're talking about that need for conversation, but have things got heated as we're kind of going through this process?
You know we don't share what we're talking about behind closed doors in the caucus. But what I can say, based on what you know that many of us have said publicly, whether that's the Prime Minister, myself, or others, is that we are seriously concerned about an increase and an escalation in hate. And that goes for people in a variety of different communities. And we saw this in a very, very real and scary way yesterday with what happened at a synagogue in Montreal.
What are you hearing from your constituents about it?
My constituents are concerned. I have the largest Jewish population in Manitoba, in Winnipeg South Centre, the riding that I represent. I, of course, have a Muslim population as well. However, in terms of the type of hate that we have seen specifically escalate in my riding, it has been disproportionately levied against the Jewish community, in part because that is where there is a heavier concentration of Jews. We've seen that through swastikas that have been spray painted on walls. We've seen that at threats that are being levied to community members. There was a window shot out at the home of someone 2 minutes from where I live last week that the police had a press conference about and talked about. We have people that are taking their mezuzahs, the religious symbol that identifies a Jewish home, off of their doors. This is happening, and these are not people who are particularly religious. This is not people who are out in the public space talking in any type of hostile way about what's happening. These are just ordinary Jews that are so scared right now, are so fearful for their kids, that they are taking off a symbol from the front door of their homes. They are taking those off in response to a fear that they are going to be targeted. And this is really, really important that when we're talking about protests, when we're talking about people's constitutional democratic right to protest peacefully, that we do not allow for the elements of those protests that are going too far, and that's not all of them, but that we are seeing that in some of these protests there is an incitement of hate. Chants like "from the river to the sea," This is what Hamas says in reference to pushing Jews into the sea. So we have to be really, really careful that we are able to be mindful of how what we say can contribute to an inciting event. But to answer the core question that you asked me a moment ago, people are fearful in a way I have never seen before.
MP Housefather spoke specifically saying police need to be watching these protests and see when they come into hate speech and start calling for those things. Would you like to see that too? Would you like to see police taking more action on this? Maybe in Winnipeg, but across the country as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like so many things in government, there are arm's length organizations. The job of the police is to enforce the law, and the enforcement of the law falls under the jurisdiction of police authority. So their determination as to what breaches that line or not should be made by them. However, I certainly am hearing from people that are concerned that some of the things that they are seeing in particular protests or in certain dialogue, whether that's online or elsewhere, is getting to a point where it is leading to an incitement of hate, where it is leading to a violent action. So I think police are incredibly vigilant about this. I'm in constant conversation in Winnipeg with the chief of police and with others, and certainly with colleagues like Minister LeBlanc. So I think that there is a heightened sensitivity to this, but I don't believe that it is the responsibility or the place for me as a parliamentarian to tell the police how they ought to enforce the law.
I think yesterday it was CJA, I could be wrong, I think it was them, who called for an acceleration of the online hate bill that we've been talking about for a while. Do you think that is something that needs to happen?
It is. Yeah, and those are conversations that colleagues and I will continue to have with representatives within our government. It's an incredibly important piece of legislation. However, it's incredibly complex. How you deal with 10,000 potentially illegal things on a social media platform is very complicated and very tricky. And I think if we look at the way that news organizations, social media platforms have been responding to government policy completely unrelated to this, imagine what it's going to be like if we try to engage with them on this. But they have a massive moral, ethical, and social obligation to be at the table for these conversations, and I don't think that they're doing enough.
Thanks for stopping.
Thanks, folks. See you later.
Si on continue comme avant, on n'arrivera pas à ce qu'on a besoin, mais ce qu'on avait dit à l'époque, c'était la relance de Medicago qu'on voulait, c'est-à-dire de garder le plus grand nombre d'employés, de garder la propriété intellectuelle chez nous, puis d'avoir aussi une façon d'avoir, j'allais dire, une version 2.0 d'un Medicago qui va pouvoir continuer dans le temps. Alors, c'était vraiment ça qu'on était en train de préparer, puis c'est ça qu'on est en train de négocier.
Puis donc, l'argent que vous leur avez déjà promis, le 173 millions, pour améliorer leur production et développer l'ex-vaccin qui n'a pas fonctionné au final, qu'en est-il de cet argent-là?
Bien, on est en train de négocier. Mitsubishi devra, parce qu'on a mis de l'avant tous les droits qu'on a en vertu de l'accord de contribution, parce qu'il y a des aspects de cet accord-là qui n'avaient pas été complétés. Donc, on reprend cet argent-là dans un sens. On demande une contribution de Medicago et avec ça, on repart la version 2.0 de Medicago. Il n'y a pas d'argent additionnel. Il n'y a pas d'argent additionnel qui va être ajouté, mais on va pouvoir faire l'état des lieux quand on aura finalisé l'accord avec Mitsubishi.
Oui, c'est sur Bombardier.
Oui.
Donc hier, on s'est parlé un peu, mais...
Oui, on peut se parler à tous les jours.
On peut se parler à tous les jours si vous voulez. Je peux prendre votre numéro tantôt si vous voulez.
En direct en plus. Pourquoi pas le partager avec le Québec?
Ben c'est ça. Hier, le gouvernement du Québec, le gouvernement de l'Ontario, qui ont sorti un communiqué pour appuyer la demande de Bombardier. Et M. Martel hier qui dit qu'en fait, il n'a pas été approché par Ottawa pour présenter son plan, même pas une seule fois.
Moi, ce que je peux vous dire, je suis en conversation avec M. Martel depuis des mois. Comme on a dit, il n'y a pas de décision qui a été prise. On a vu évidemment la sortie de M. Legault, M. Ford. Et vous savez, moi j'ai toujours dit, il y a trois choses là-dedans. Il y a un enjeu de sécurité nationale, il y a un enjeu de faire le meilleur choix pour les contribuables, puis en même temps de promouvoir l'industrie aérospatiale. On est le troisième pays au monde dans la production d'avions, donc il y a des milliers de sous-traitants dans cette industrie-là. Alors le choix qu'on va faire doit prendre en compte ces trois enjeux-là. Comme j'ai toujours dit, c'est une décision complexe, mais pour l'instant, il n'y a pas de décision qui a été prise.
Pourquoi ne pas soutenir cette industrie-là comme l'industrie automobile?
On la soutient, moi je vous dis. Ben non, mais au contraire, on la soutient largement. Mais comme j'ai dit hier, je dis à tout le monde, prudence, parce qu'il y a des fournisseurs de deux côtés. Moi, je vous incite à parler à tout le monde m'appelle. Alors, c'est pas compliqué, mais il y a des fournisseurs des deux côtés. Il y a des gens qui voudraient que ça soit d'un côté, il y en a qui voudraient que ça soit de l'autre. L'important, c'est que ça soit un processus qui permette justement d'avoir les capacités qu'on a besoin au niveau de la défense, protéger l'intérêt des contribuables et en même temps favoriser l'industrie aérospatiale canadienne, québécoise, qui est très forte. Mais comme je vous dis, qu'il y a des fournisseurs des deux côtés. Alors, c'est ça qu'on continue de faire.
De quel côté, personnellement, là, en tant que ministre de l'Industrie?
Moi, je pense du côté de l'industrie aérospatiale canadienne, définitivement. C'est mon rôle. C'est ça du côté que je pense.
M. Champagne, le président de l'Association canadienne des employés professionnels a démissionné à la suite de commentaires jugés antisémites dans les derniers jours. Il est fonctionnaire à Statistique Canada. Vous êtes le ministre responsable de Statistique Canada. Qu'est-ce que vous croyez qui devrait être fait dans la fonction publique dans un dossier comme celui-là?
J'ai pas vu, vous m'apprenez cette nouvelle-là. Je m'en excuse, je ne l'ai pas vu dans les derniers jours. Il y a eu beaucoup de choses. Je vais prendre les détails, puis ça va me faire plaisir de vous revenir, mais j'ai pas vu les détails de cette annonce-là ou de cette déclaration.
Parlant d'une industrie qui va pas bien, les médias, est-ce que vous appuyez un fonds d'urgence pour les médias?
Oui, très préoccupé parce que vous savez, quand j'ai vu, par exemple, la fermeture des stations de TVA, pour moi, les nouvelles régionales, c'est essentiel. D'avoir une voix forte des médias au Québec, c'est essentiel. Alors, effectivement, on est saisi de ça. J'en ai parlé avec ma collègue, la ministre Saint-Onge. Je sais qu'elle regarde ça parce que, honnêtement, c'est pas seulement la salle des nouvelles, mais c'est aussi dans un monde où on a de plus en plus de désinformation, d'avoir des médias nationaux, régionaux, provinciaux qui amènent cette voie-là de la rigueur journalistique, des faits. Moi, je pense que c'est très important. Puis aussi, parce qu'on ne va pas se retrouver dans une société où on va juste avoir des salles de nouvelles, soit au Québec, de la capitale nationale, puis de la métropole. C'est important d'avoir cette voie-là régionale et ça me tient à cœur. C'est des gens avec qui je travaille.
Parce que la ministre Saint-Onge dit qu'il faut laisser les nouvelles politiques faire agir avant de faire autre chose. Est-ce que vous devez agir dans l'urgence en ce moment?
Ben, c'est sûr qu'il y a urgence, mais je vous dirais que cette urgence-là, la ministre Saint-Onge en est saisie et il y a différents acteurs, même du secteur, qui ont demandé de me parler, avec qui je vais leur parler, bien évidemment, parce que l'idée, c'est de voir comment on peut aider. Puis oui, je pense qu'il y a urgence d'agir dans ce dossier.
Mais urgence d'avoir un fonds d'aide de 50 millions?
Merci.
About testimony from committee yesterday, your department, Assistant Deputy Minister Cameron McDonald, made some pretty serious allegations accusing the Chief Technology Officer of Canada of lying to committee. So there's a lot of explosive testimony there from your department. How do you respond?
Well, I don't have a response in the moment. I'll have to get back to you. I'm aware of the testimony, but want to dig through it myself so that I can comment in a way that is reflective of me having looked at all the evidence.
Are there any disciplinary actions underway for Mr. McDonald?
Again, it's just being made aware of this. So obviously concerned by the testimony. Going to be taking a look at it. Need a moment to digest it and to sort of poke at the different edges of it to understand it, and then we'll have to look at what the way forward is from there. Okay, thank you.
Sur la masse salariale pour les régions. On a C18 également. Moi, je pense qu'on doit travailler conjointement pour tout faire pour préserver nos médias. Parce
qu'il n'y a pas lieu, après les
coupes
à TVA, après les coupes à CTV, le journal Métro, les coupes de l'information, ça va pas bien. Au Canada anglais aussi, est-ce qu'il n'y a pas lieu d'avoir une aide supplémentaire, donc un fonds d'aide?
Écoutez, c'est sûr que ma collègue regarde ça, mais pour nous, c'est fondamental que les médias, vous, puissiez continuer à faire votre travail. Les questions que vous posez là sont fondamentales. Ça fait partie de notre système démocratique. Vous devez non seulement subsister, mais rester fort.
Donc vous dites qu'il y a assez de... Il y a déjà
non, ce que je dis, c'est que c'est une décision que ma collègue prendra. Il y a plusieurs programmes en place, mais il faut toujours rester ouvert à faire plus.
Concernant les propos de M. Charkaoui, est-ce que vous les avez entendus? Est-ce que ça a sa place? Est-ce qu'il faut les condamner, ces propos?
Ça n'a aucune place dans notre société. C'est un discours haineux et dangereux.
On entend dire que le gouvernement fédéral ne financera pas le tramway de Québec. Est-ce que c'est bien le cas?
Ma déclaration là-dessus a été très claire au cours des derniers jours. Nous avons été très clairs depuis 2018. Le gouvernement canadien a toujours été là pour défendre dès le début le projet de tramway et ça va continuer à être le cas.
Mais ça vient d'où ces rumeurs-là? Même Mme Guilbeault a laissé planer un doute quant à la volonté du fédéral de financer ce projet-là.
Bien, j'ai en nouveau, hier, envoyé à tout le monde, dont Mme Guilbeault. Tous les journalistes de la région de Québec ont reçu la déclaration. S'il y a quelqu'un qui ne sait pas encore dans la région de Québec quelle était et quelle est ma position là-dessus, bien, on est très heureux de pouvoir la partager. De nouveau, cette déclaration que tout le monde, je pense, qui est concerné et intéressé, a reçu dans les derniers jours et à nouveau hier.
Soutenir le projet de tramway, le transport en commun, ça veut dire quoi concrètement?
Bien, ça veut dire amener Québec dans le groupe des villes au Québec, au Canada et au Québec qui ont un réseau de transport moderne. On est la seule ville de taille comparable au pays à ne pas avoir de réseau de transport collectif moderne. On a un retard remarquable à rattraper. La bonne nouvelle, c'est qu'il y a des investissements majeurs que tous les 3 niveaux de gouvernement sont prêts à faire depuis déjà presque 6 ans. C'est le temps d'aller de l'avant.
Je vais jouer l'innocente, là, soutenir, ça peut être juste dire bravo, vas-y, continue mon ami. Concrètement, en dollars, sonnant, retentissant, ça veut dire quoi?
C'est clair depuis déjà plusieurs semaines. À nouveau, c'est clair depuis plusieurs jours. Ça se résume en 2 choses. On a 4 milliards de dollars quand on met les 3 gouvernements ensemble, déjà prêts à aller de l'avant pour une phase 1 que la Ville de Québec pourrait aller de l'avant. Et en plus, à partir de 2026, donc dans à peine 2 ans, le gouvernement canadien a une enveloppe de 3 milliards de dollars additionnels récurrentes à l'échelle nationale que le gouvernement du Québec pourra utiliser, s'il le souhaite, pour compléter les phases du tramway que la Ville de Québec a le plan et l'espoir de mettre en place.
M. Duclos, pour revenir sur Bombardier, hier, il y a eu un communiqué de Québec et du gouvernement Ford en Ontario pour mettre de la pression sur le gouvernement. Est-ce que votre position a changé? Est-ce que vous avez cheminé peut-être depuis hier?
Bien, à nouveau, on est très reconnaissant et on trouve ça très important que différents partenaires, y compris les gouvernements de l'Ontario et du Québec, manifestent leur point de vue et leur intérêt. Nous sommes aussi à l'écoute, évidemment, de l'industrie aéronautique au Canada et au Québec, qui est très importante. On est très conscient des besoins majeurs de la défense nationale. On est conscient aussi du contexte géopolitique de plus en plus compliqué et inquiétant à l'échelle mondiale. Donc, beaucoup de besoins, beaucoup d'enjeux, et le point de vue de tous est important dans le contexte que l'on vit, et la décision va être prise là, quand le moment sera venu.
Mais on n'est pas quand même aux premières étapes de tous les processus de demande de proposition, d'appel d'offres, etc. Là, ça, on a l'impression que ça fait... Les gens qui regardent ça de l'extérieur, peut-être ils ont l'impression que ça fait des années que le gouvernement est un petit peu en processus d'appel d'offres.
Bon, sur ce projet en particulier, ça fait 2 ans que les gens à l'échelle du pays et au sein du gouvernement travaillent. Les processus d'approvisionnement en défense militaire, on le sait, sont toujours complexes parce que c'est pas juste le produit. Le produit change avec le temps, la technologie évolue. C'est aussi le contexte mondial qui change rapidement. On voit ce qui se passe sur la planète. Et c'est un processus qui doit aussi investir pour le futur. On parle d'avions qui vont être importants pour les prochaines décennies, donc il faut faire le bon choix et de la bonne manière.
Ce qu'on lit entre les lignes un peu, c'est que Bombardier, ça peut prendre un petit peu plus de temps.
Il y a différentes options qui ont déjà été proposées et dont les gens font valoir la possible utilité.
Écoutez, parce que hier, M. Martel dit en comité qu'il n'avait pas été... Ottawa l'avait juste pas approché pendant tout le processus, mis à part pour février 2022. Donc là, depuis ce temps-là, il n'y a eu aucune communication entre le gouvernement et Bombardier là-dessus. Est-ce qu'il ne faudrait pas au moins écouter l'offre de la compagnie?
L'écoute et la collaboration font effectivement partie de tout processus qui mène à de bonnes décisions à la fin. Le fait que M. Martel se soit prononcé encore hier, le fait que d'autres membres de l'industrie aéronautique le fassent, le fait que je sois avec eux. D'ailleurs, aujourd'hui, je vais être présent à la réunion de l'association sur l'heure du midi, j'ai participé avec eux. Le fait que beaucoup d'autres de mes collègues, évidemment, dont M. Champagne et M. Blair, soient en contact avec eux, c'est la bonne chose à faire. Merci.
Est-ce que la porte est encore ouverte à Bombardier? Les décisions sont
Bien, la décision n'a pas encore été prise. Alors, on va continuer à faire le travail important qui a besoin d'être fait pour y arriver. Merci.
Can I ask you about your support of the Conservative private members bill on farming exemptions for the carbon tax?
Not just my support, it's Jagmeet Singh's, it's Yves Blanchette's, it's the entire House, and I was glad to see that the Senate did not reject amendments that were being proposed from the AgFo Committee. But I think it's important for all journalists. You know, the government has taken some criticism about a very specific exemption on a vulnerable group of people around home heating oil that applies across the country. Your question should be to some of the leaders that are trying to cherry pick and say the government is not being fair as to why they support it. I think it was the right play, but they are being hypocritical criticizing the government on the home heating exemption, on home heating oil, when they actually supported a bill that is very specific and important and acute, but it's a small group of people. I support it, but they shouldn't be able to get it both ways.
Can I ask you, though, about this farming? This is another exemption to the carbon tax for farmers. So why would you support another exemption when we've heard other Liberal ministers saying there will be no more exemptions?
I'm not a Liberal minister.
But, okay, so why is it something that you want to support?
Because it matters to the people I represent, particularly on the grain drying element. I have, for example, some of the largest onion producers in Atlantic Canada. They've had a very tough year in terms of the fact that it's been very wet. There was a lot of rain. They have no other way to be able to actually dry the onions without using natural gas. There's no other commercially viable alternative. So at the end of the day, if they don't have the ability to change to something different, why would we have the carbon price signal? It's exempted, it's sunset, so we're hoping that technology will be there down the line to be able to make that happen. But I think it's a reasonable exemption. It's really important for agriculture and rural Canada. And in fact, it really matters in the prairie provinces as well. So at the end of the day, that's why I support it, because it makes a difference for the people I represent and indeed people across the country.
But what about those exemptions for heating barns? Because, you know, the committee said that there was the technology, that they wouldn't need an exemption for heating barns. So why would...
Some senators said that. The majority of the House of Commons actually believed that that was a reasonable exemption. And again, I would reference you to Elizabeth May, who supported this bill. I would reference you to the entire NDP caucus, the entire Bloc caucus, and of course the Conservatives. So this was something that was seen across the country. My point to you is very specifically, when I see Jagmeet Singh standing up and saying that this was an unreasonable exemption for some of the most vulnerable households, this being the government's position on heating oil specifically, people that are paying 4 times the amount to heat their homes, and we have a program to help them transition. He calls that a regional play when there's 80,000 people in British Columbia that are vulnerable as well. But then he supports this type of exemption, which I support, but he doesn't have the right to be able to stand up in one breath and say the government is being selective when he actually supported a type of exemption as well on that particular bill.
But this would be for all farmers, so is that selective?
This is available for all Canadians that are on heating oil. And this is what the national media is missing. And I have a chip on my shoulder as a regional MP. There is 900,000 households outside of Atlantic Canada that benefit from this. These are some of the most vulnerable Canadians. The NDP talk about the fact that they support vulnerable Canadians, except when this is a specific program to help them get off heating oil. And again, you should ask the question to Jagmeet Singh how he can step up and ask and say that the government is being selective when he actually supported a bill that is very selective to exempt on carbon pricing. I think it's the right call, by the way, but he can't have the right to say that and then criticize the government on a very specific exemption to help the most vulnerable.
You think it's sort of, thanks. You know, what we saw in the United States with the Democratic vote and how they're really voting on abortion access. Do you think that that is any sort of sign as to whether there should be something in the next election that is a topic of discussion in terms of abortion?
I think it's always something that we have to keep in mind and we have to guard against in this country, because we've seen already the Conservatives bring motions and try and pass legislation that gets us to that next step that could put our, belief in a woman's right to choose in question. So I don't think we should take it for granted, and I think we should stay on guard, and we need to protect that right.
Do you think it needs, in terms of protecting it, do you think it needs to be an election issue where it is something that we're talking about in the election, the next upcoming election?
I think Canadians will decide, but I don't think we should take it for granted. And it's a good point. It is maybe something we need to talk about more and secure that right for Canadian women.
Okay, thanks for stopping.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Take care.